Today, we are going to see if we can investigate how rationing impacted the daily lives of civilians during World War II. Let's start with a little warm-up. Can you spot the mistake in each box and see if you can correct it? For example, take a look at the blue box. It says VE Day stands for Victory Everywhere Day. Can you spot the mistake here? What does VE Day actually stand for? Was it Victory Everywhere? Or was it Victory in Europe Day? How many more mistakes can you spot and correct? Have fun! To start our main challenge today, we need to answer some quick questions. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, what is rationing? What could have been rationed? And when do you think rationing started? Well, we know there was some rationing during World War I too. This was because a lot of Britain's food was imported from other countries. It was a very good technique for Britain's enemies to bomb the boats that were importing the food. This would cut off supplies to the country. This meant that there wasn't a lot of food left coming into the country. The food that was left was then very expensive, and there wasn't a lot to go around. Some people did try to grow their own food, but this would take a long time, and there still wasn't enough for everybody. This meant that some people would starve and go hungry. In order to make sure that everybody got a fair share of food, rationing was introduced. This meant everyone had to have the same amount of food and supplies. This meant that instead of some people getting a lot and some people only getting very little, everybody got a fair amount. This was called rationing. It also meant that people had to save what they had. They also had to be very, very creative with the recipes that they used. Some key ingredients, such as wheat, which was used to make bread, weren't as readily available, so different ingredients needed to be used, which meant the bread wasn't quite as successful as it had been in the past. Let's go back to our key questions. So, we now know what rationing is, but when do you think rationing might have started? Lessons were clearly learned from World War I, so let's take a look at a timeline and see if we can find out a little bit more about World War II. What do you notice? During World War I, rationing didn't start until towards the end of the war. What do you know about rationing during World War II? Was it the same or was it a little bit different? You're right. Petrol was rationed straight away at the start of World War II. Food supplies such as bacon, butter and sugar were also rationed very early on in the war. What else do you notice from our timeline? Think about where the different foods might come from. Think about how they would be made. What else was added to the rationing list? Was it only food? What do you notice about when rationing ended? How does this compare to the end of the war? Why do you think that might be? Let's take a closer look at the items which were rationed and how much of each portion people were allowed. This was one weekly World War II ration portion for one adult. How does this compare to the amount of milk that you drink in your house? Do you think you could have one egg for a full week? What about that amount of margarine? Here's an example of a weekly menu for one household during World War II, using the rations that they would have been allowed. What do you think of this menu? Do you think you would enjoy eating this kind of food? Notice how creative people needed to be during the war to make the best use of their rations. How do you think this menu would compare to your typical menu in your house? Do you think you could spot any similarities? Do you think you might spot any differences? See if you can complete your own menu for 1 week. Then, see how many comparisons you can make between a menu now and a menu during the war. Some people might argue that the wartime menu was healthier. After all, they did have to make the best use of their supplies, and they had to use smaller portions, which I suppose is a little bit healthier. Look at the sentence cards which have been loaded onto the virtual classroom. Can you come up with some arguments for and against each of the statements? Use full sentences and give reasons for your ideas. Enjoy!